work. Now, the rest of today I will spend on a kind of reconstruct. Yes. Do you have a political question?
No.
Okay.
What does it do?
Sorry?
What does it do?
When is it due? I wanted to avoid that question because I don't know. What do you need? A month? Let's say a month?
End of January?
End of January? That's very soon. End of February. Okay. Let's say 1 month from now. So it's middle February. Is that a good compromise? 15th of February is my proposal. Yeah?
I have a question about the course.
Yeah?
Why do you focus only on riots?
Well, I have to focus. That's a very late question. Retrospective. I can answer that. I'll try to answer that. It's a good point because it makes me. I hope that it makes the rest of my presentation more clear-headed. But actually, it's an answer. This focus. It's an answer to a question that was posed by people who are not at all in the architecture world, but people who immediately after the big riots in France in fall of 2005, there were many publicists, journalists, political commentators who blamed architecture for the riots. So this is a kind of response to that, because it was a challenge. It was a really big challenge from the New York Times, The Guardian, French newspapers, Dutch newspapers, that it was because of the architecture of the high-rise Corbusier-influenced architecture of the 50s and 60s that was built around nearly every French town, that because of the specific qualities of that architecture, it created an urban condition that was so hostile to a positive social development that it could be seen as the root cause of the urban violence and the riots that happened in 2005. And the interesting thing is there were either architects of the kind of neo-traditionalist side who said, yes, that's absolutely true, that is why we have to build everything in a kind of neo-18th century way. Or there were architects of the more modernist side who said, no, that is absolutely not true, we cannot be blamed for anything social, we just create the backdrop. And I thought that both responses were much too easy, much too how do you say, partisan, much too defending their own job, more or less. I think that was the first reason, to answer a question that was posed from the outside to the architectural profession. And the other is that by looking at, by using something extremely strange and extremely how do you say, unexpected, like urban riots, to look at the development of architecture and urban planning and urban politics. It gives you a way to look at your own profession from a completely different point of view, and to also try to, it's a kind of a wake-up call also to the sometimes very harsh reality that you as architects work in. So I hope that is a beginning of an answer. Yes.
About an assignment. Does it need to be a real city with a real situation? Or it can be a purely imaginary situation like something zombie movie, totally schizophrenic?
I'd rather not. But you know, the best zombie movies are the ones that take place in real cities. You know, the idea that you imagine, oh my God, what if zombies would take over Culemborg? So, you know, so just as zombie movies would not make any sense if they take place in an area that you would, because then they wouldn't be scary, right?
No, I mean not the city as a reality, but the situation as a reality. I mean, this Should they be real, or they?
I think to make it more interesting, they should start out with being real, and then it's up to you where you want to let them go off the map, where you want to bend the line so they become progressively more bizarre. But that's up to you. But I think there should be, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. You know, it's about reading the world around you and reading your own position as an architect through the possibility of disaster. I think that's the whole point. So if you want to make the disaster this big and the reality that big, or vice versa, that's up to you. But there should be this ingredient of reality. I think it's important to make a scary story. Okay, I've collected some images that Claudia Runge of our chair has made just as examples for how you can use images as a way to tell a complex story. They're very different ones. Only one of them falls in the kind of panoramic mode. This is, for example, one image that describes Detroit before, during, after, and maybe way beyond the riot. So it goes from a flourishing industrial city through the riots to a kind of urban disaster area, and then is reborn as a kind of urban farming Garden of Eden. This one uses a very famous map of the Situationists in the 50s to describe how the riots in the French high-rise suburbs did not jump to each other in a territorial way, but in a kind of typological way. It describes how they all these high-rise areas that were genetically or architecturally the same, they all got infected by this riot virus, and not just because they lay next door to each other. And the third one it's also a kind of allegorical picture about how the movie screen, the television screen, the cable news, helicopters, the event create a kind of virtual reality of violence and racism and segregation that was so powerful that it is nearly like one of those 80s horror movies where the things that happen inside the television escape from the television into the living room and take over the world. So these are just examples of how you can use images to tell these kinds of very complex, sometimes intuitive, associative stories in a much more, direct and nearly emotional way than you would be able to do just using text. So this is just for your inspiration. Now, what I created out of the last 4-5 lectures is a kind of remix, a kind of, and I hope to, it's a kind of summary, a kind of, I'll try to draw some conclusions in the end, or propose some possible conclusions. But anyway, what I've tried to do is to draw out the elements that you see in every riot, and I've made it into I've found 12 elements, 12 categories, 12 issues that you see repeated in the 4 riots that we saw, but often in completely different ways. So this is why I call it a 12-step program to urban rioting. Of course, 12-step program is inspired by the Alcoholics Anonymous Association that has a 12-step program to kick the addiction to alcohol. But this is an unexpected use of this method. The first is trigger. There has to be a triggering event. The first we saw was, of course, the triggering event was the police and this is Detroit 1967, the first one we talked about, where the police tried to, or the police wanted to invade and arrest the people in an illegal bar in the middle of the night in Detroit. But the bar was not, this illegal bar where they served alcohol illegally was not, there were not like 20 people who they imagined, but there were more than 80, and they started fighting back against the police. So it's like the police tried to shut down a bar, the customers protest, the people of the neighborhood hear all the noise, and instead of thinking, what's that noise, they also start fighting back against the police. So this is the triggering event. The triggering event of the riots in 1985 in London, in the Broadwater Farm riots, where the police who invaded a house looking for a drug dealer, and in all the kind of chaos and the kind of struggle inside the house to find this boy, his mother had a heart attack and died, which triggered street fighting, fights with the police, etc. in the entire neighborhood. The third event, and this one is more, is in an interesting way more complicated. The triggering event of the riots in 1992 in Los Angeles were triggered by another police action, but then more than a year before, and that is very interesting. And not so much by the police action itself, but by the fact that it was first filmed. So a drunk driver was pulled out of his car, Rodney King, and even while lying on the ground, they kept on beating and beating and beating him. And this was filmed by somebody standing around it. On the basis of this film, the 4 policemen were indicted, and they were, but then a year later, they were acquitted by the jury. And it was the acquittal and the fact that this acquittal, the verdict of the judge was played live on television. Everybody was expecting what will happen with this verdict. The verdict was acquittal, and then the riots broke out. So here you can see it's the same thing, a police action, brutality against a member of a minority group, but then not just delayed, but also, you could say, expanded and made bigger and made louder, amplified by the media. So you could say it's an artificial trigger, or a trigger that was artificially amplified. And the fourth trigger, the trigger of the French riots in 2005, was 2 boys who thought that the police was going to arrest them, and the police who thought that the boys had done something wrong, because why were they otherwise running away? The boys were chased by the police, ran into an electricity transformation station and were electrocuted and died, which then triggered the outbreak of violence. So we have 4 triggers, all 4 of them police actions against the members of the minority group. All 4, interestingly, even if you put them under a microscope, these triggers, and you would not even look at what happened before or after, all of them tell the same story, but in interestingly different ways. Here's the transformation, the electricity station. The third, the second element, the second step, spread. How do these things spread? In Detroit, they spread in a very classical, territorial way. It literally happened that first this street corner, the people come out of their houses and start fighting the police, etc. And then it grows bigger and bigger from street to street until it literally like literally like a fire spreads out over